I feel like I need to address this a little more because I'm rereading the comment. The comment said, saying that there is a sin a born again believer cannot commit is backloading works. But the thing is that there's only one sin that condemns, and that is the sin of unbelief, rejecting Jesus Christ. If you do not believe on him, you are condemned. And the sin of Cain is rooted in unbelief. That they deny, he's talking about antichrists, who are liars, who deny that Jesus is the Christ. That they deny that he accomplished the work. They deny that he's the propitiation for the sins. And their denial of that is manifested eventually when they hate the brethren and reject and refuse to know the sons of God by the testimony. And again, it's not just the sin of hating your brother, it's the sin of unbelief. That's why it's a sin unto death. It is the absolute refusal to recognize Jesus Christ. There is no sin that you can commit as a believer that would disqualify you for salvation or show that you're not saved. Because all sin is transgression of the law, and the law has shut all of our mouths, so that all of us are guilty before God. But, according to John, there's something called a sin unto death, which is committed not by a believer, but by an unbeliever, and the unbelief is the sin. That's the point. The hatred that Cain manifests is rooted in unbelief. But what's strange about these antichrists is that they are seductive enough that he has to warn the church about them because they pretend to believe. They masquerade as believers. Yet they hate the brethren and they deny that Jesus is the Christ. Specifically that he accomplished the work. I mean, that's his way of saying he did. They obviously must confess Jesus to some level because they are able to circulate among believers who are assembled into that name. But they're not believers. Again, the only sin that will send you to hell is unbelief. Because the blood covers all of our sins. And every sin defined by the law is transgression and is something that the propitiation covers. Even hatred, even murder, even adultery, covetousness, blasphemous, all of those things are transgressions of the law that are covered by the law, by the blood. But if you reject the blood, you have no offering. You don't have a propitiation. If you reject the propitiation, what do you have? So the sin that everybody is eventually damned for is the sin of unbelief. And that's consistent with the entirety of scriptures. So no, I don't think it's backloading works to say, it would be backloading works to say, oh, a believer can't commit a sin that's defined by the law, murder, hatred, any of those things. No, this sin is the sin of unbelief. It's the sin unto death. It is refusal. It is a denial of Jesus Christ. John makes it clear all the way through his gospel and epistle that if you believe Jesus is the Christ, you're born of God. If you believe God's testimony concerning his Son, you're born of God. But if you don't, you're condemned. That's his point. So it's not backloading works to require faith. Now, there's apparently arguments. I don't know what's out there, but one born-again believer says another born-again believer is not saved. And supposedly they're both clear on the gospel. Well, if they're both clear on the gospel, then they must believe that the other person doesn't believe the gospel. And maybe that other person has enough heresy surrounding their gospel that they haven't made the presentation clear. That's not the same thing. That's when one believer is requiring belief as the evidence of another person's salvation. That's what we require. And maybe the other person isn't showing it, or maybe there's a miscommunication or a communication breakdown that's so bad that they can't, That is not the same thing as Cain. Cain brought his works to the table and wanted to be justified by them, and denied that God's way of justifying was through the blood, and hated Abel because God received him. I mean, and it is a deep knowledge of it. God talked to Cain. This is a weird intrinsic knowledge of God, but you're not in the fellowship. You're not actually a believer. You're not justified. It's the truth is right at the surface, and you reject it, and you don't believe. So that's again what Cain is. Cain is an unbeliever. Now, what I've seen is people who seem to believe the gospel because they contended for once saved, always saved, or even faith. Faith is the way we're justified. But then when they ended up hating a brother and they wanted to say he wasn't saved, they started to change. They didn't really change their gospel. They started to reveal what they really believed. That faith was something other than being firmly persuaded that what God had said about his son is true, and that he died for our sins according to the scriptures and rose for our justification according to the scriptures. Okay? Instead, it was a mystical, works-based kind of spark within that is not very definable. John MacArthur did that perfectly, right? That's what the crux of Lordship salvation is that they've redefined faith. And there are a lot of different subtle ways that people can eventually manifest that they didn't really believe the gospel all along. They had another Jesus or another gospel or another spirit, but it was subtle enough that we couldn't detect it until a very long time. And that's what he's dealing with in 1 John. He's talking about subtlety. These are those that seduce you. And you thought they were in the fellowship. And now you're wondering if they left the fellowship and now they're denying that Jesus is the Christ. What implications does that have for the gospel? Are you saved? Can you trust it? Well, I'm telling you, says John, that they didn't believe in the first place. Okay, they went out because they were not of us. They did not believe. They were liars that they pretended to believe. They said they walked in the light. They said they had no sin. That should have been a clue. They said they loved God but hated the brethren. That should be a clue. So he's giving them all these clues to say, look, they showed all along that they weren't of us. But they had a sophisticated enough pretend profession that it flew under the radar. So there are plenty of professions of faith that look like the real thing until you start digging around and find out what do they really believe about Jesus Christ. And that's what he really puts it all on. The sin of Cain is basically unbelief, but it's a special kind of unbelief because the world doesn't believe the gospel. I mean, there's plenty of people that don't believe the gospel. But these are people that are close enough to God and in the midst of the congregation, so to speak, that with knowledge can then hate and persecute the righteous. It's different. It's a religious kind of atheism, a religious rejection of Christ, antichrist. All right, hopefully that's the last thing I can say about this right now.